I've worked in summer camps in Canada and the USA, and I picked out 7 key categories that show the main differences between the two countries. Now, as a little caveat before we get into those differences, the day-to-day of camp is largely the same. And like the job roles and the type of thing you're going to be doing is pretty similar. So if you're thinking about working in a summer camp this year, you need to be aware of these differences because you're going to have a different experience depending on the location that you choose to go. So the first category is after camp traveling. And this is a really important thing to consider because most staff, especially international staff, spend most of the money that they earn at camp on traveling around the country afterwards. So what can you do in each country and what options actually exist? Now, the thing with Canada is it is a really beautiful country. The nature there is pretty unmatched with anywhere else I've been. And there's also some great cities to explore. You've got Toronto, Quebec, and Vancouver. Now, one of the key issues that you'll find is that Canada is such a big flipping country. Essentially, what this means is that if you want to see both Toronto and Vancouver, you've got to take a pretty lengthy flight to get between the two cities. And whilst there is so much to do in Canada, I mean, you can even see like Niagara Falls, right? Lots of this stuff is really spread out and you've got to spend money and time to see it. And the thing with the USA is that it's still a little bit spread out, but you've got even more stuff to do. So you can go and see New York City and then you can hop over to Boston or Philadelphia, which is kind of reasonably close, and you can have that kind of big city experience. But equally, if you want more of like a beach life, you can head over to California. It obviously goes without saying, you've got all of those theme parks down in Orlando. And yeah, of course, whilst these are kind of spread out similar way to Canada, domestic flights in the USA tend to be a little bit cheaper, at least in my experience. So it's a little bit easier to get around these different locations. Now, another thing that you might want to consider as well is that as part of your contract and your visa, like work permit of working at summer camp, is that in Canada, you get 6 months of traveling after you finish your contract. Whereas in the USA, this is limited to 30 days. So in the States, you might have more stuff to do, but less time to do it. But I think on balance, the USA has got to win this category. There's just so much more to do. The next category I want to talk about is like accessibility for international staff. I mean, we all know that it can be a little bit overwhelming when you're thinking about applying and going through the application process. Now, with all of the stuff that you need to do, like getting your visa and the forms that you have to submit, which country is it easier to get placed at and find a summer camp job? Now, the thing with finding a job at a Canadian camp is that the agency fees tend to be a lot lower. So this means that there's less of an upfront cost if you want to go to Canada. And another advantage with working at a Canadian summer camp is that you don't have to go to the Canadian embassy to get your visa. In fact, all you need to do is get a work permit, which you get on arrival to Canada. So when you go to the airport, it just means you go in a separate line. However, the thing with working in a summer camp in the USA is that there's a lot more variety of agencies to choose from. Whereas with Canada, Camp Canada have a little bit of a monopoly, over the industry. And this just means that when it comes to working in an American summer camp, you can shop around a little bit more and maybe get a little bit more bang for your buck. However, on balance, Canada wins this category. I mean, you have less forms to submit. And I think the main thing as well is you don't have to go down to the embassy, right? With America, you have to get a J1 working visa, and that basically means that you have to go down to the American embassy in London, or I think there's one in Dublin or Belfast as well. And that just incurs more transport costs to start with. So if you're keeping score, it is 1 apiece. Now, category 3 is maybe a little bit more niche, right? But I want to talk about the natural beauty. Because after all, you're going to be spending your entire summer in this one place. So you want to be sure that the surroundings are pretty serene and idyllic, right? And just as a little bit of context, the camp that I worked at in Canada is 2.5 hours north of Toronto, more or less. And the first 30 minutes, you're still kind of getting around the outskirts of the city. But then after that, there's just nobody lives there. I mean, you just see trees and like maybe the occasional bear, but, but that's it. So the thing with Canada is you just have lots of untouched, natural, like beautiful landscapes and wildlife, right? And as a result of this, the lakes tend to be a key feature of the camps because there's just nobody really in the surrounding area. And in contrast to this, I think the camps and like the natural kind of surroundings in America tends to just feel a little bit more artificial and a little bit more man-made. I think this is mainly because the camps tend to be located a lot closer to like civilization and pretty built up areas. And this is maybe a little bit of a generalization, but I think it's typically true. So in this regard, I think Canada's got to take the win again. So 2-1 to Canada. Now, the thing that you need to understand about these summer camps is that typically, like 90% of cases, they tend to be privately owned and ran as a business. And as a result of this, most of the money that the camp directors earn is reinvested back into the camp in terms of like facilities and resources, basically just to try and entice like the parents to spend money and send their kids to summer camp. Obviously, also for the kids and the counselors to have a good experience, but it goes without saying that it kind of has like a dual purpose. The thing with Canadian camps is that they do have really good facilities, and kind of like I mentioned before, lots of the resources are focused on the lake. So as a general rule of thumb, you're probably going to find a lot more water sports at Canada and things like involving a boat. So you might have activities like wakeboarding and water skiing, which you might not find at every camp in the USA. And despite this, private camps tend to be a little bit cheaper in Canada than the USA, so the camp directors have a little bit less money to reinvest. And whilst there is still a really good range of facilities at Canadian camps, I think it just goes without saying that America is just the land of more and excess. And that kind of rings true still for summer camps. And just giving you some examples, maybe like, I don't know, the pens and pencils in the arts department or the music equipment just tends to be a little bit newer, a little bit better, a little bit more abundant in the American summer camps compared to Canadian summer camps. And I think as a result of just having more funds and kind of more resources available, the activities that you do in the evening in America tend to have a little bit more variety. And in addition to this, my American camp had trips every week. So one week we might have gone to a theme park, another week we would have gone to a water park or like a museum, and that just doesn't really exist in Canada. To be honest, this is probably something less to do with money and more to do with like location, like we touched on before. The thing is, Canada's just so spread out from any of these kind of attractions. You don't necessarily have that luxury. But I think it does show to an extent the kind of money that American camps have to spend. So I think with all of that considered, the USA does kind of win this category. So that brings the USA back level with Canada, and the scores are now 2-2. Now, category 5 might be a little bit contentious, but we're going to talk about the cultural differences and kind of the differences in people between Canada and America. And look, it's important to say at this point, this is just me speaking from personal experience as a British person going overseas. But I think on the whole, I've got to be honest, Canadians were just a little bit nicer than Americans. I think they're more similar to the average British person, and they're just a little bit more laid back. There's a reason why Canada tends to be one of like the top countries in terms of acceptance and diversity, and that kind of really rings true at camp as well. And that's not to say that that wasn't the case in America, but I think Canada just took it to a whole new level. And kind of a cool little quirk as well is that you'll find loads of French people in Canadian camps, just like, especially if you go to Quebec. Now, the thing with Americans is they are quite nice, but they are very, very full on. And this is, I would say, quite a big difference between the average British person and the average American person. And this can be a little bit grating sometimes. And maybe there's a few more personality clashes in American camps. But, on the whole, I'd say everybody gets along at camp. And in terms of the cultural differences, I mean, they're not massive. Look, it's like maple syrup versus cheeseburgers. Look, that's not to say my opinion is going to ring true for everybody, but it's just how I felt, right? So I think I would give this category to Canada, and that takes the score overall to 3-2 in Canada's favour. Now, we're moving on to category 6 now, which I put down as pay for staff. It's really important to say that money should not be your main factor in determining if you want to work at summer camp. In fact, it shouldn't even be in the top 3. But I'm not that naive, and I appreciate that it does come into play a little bit. The thing with Canada is the pay does tend to be a little bit less than America. I don't know why, but at least in my experience, for first timers, you do tend to earn a little bit less. And not only that, but the Canadian dollar does tend to be a little bit weaker and have a little bit of a worse exchange rate in comparison with the American dollar. But the thing you need to consider with the USA is that even though there are loads of agencies that exist that send you to summer camp, the pay can vary wildly between agencies. So just as a little example, I know one person that got paid around $800 after taxes and fees with Camp America. With Camp Leaders, this figure is much closer to $2,000. But even still, I think somebody went with Bunak and got close to $3,000. So it's important to shop around. But I think on balance, there's not that much difference between pay, right? It's quite negligible, especially after you take into account the money that you spend initially. As we mentioned, it's higher if you want to go to an American camp because you've got to travel to London, higher fees, etc., etc. So I think with this in mind, I've got to give a point to both countries here and just call it a draw. Like, there's not that much of a big difference. And we have arrived at our final category, category 7. And I want to talk about staff life and days off. Now, generally speaking, you'll get about 1 day off each week that your contract lasts for. And this translates to 7 or 8 days off throughout the summer. And during this time off, you're going to want to do things with the friends that you've made and explore the area a little bit more. And the thing with Canada is you've got so much nature to explore and experience, literally on your doorstep, probably even more than America. So if you want to go kayaking or canoeing or like just exploring some random forest, you can do that. The downside comes when you remember that, like, realistically, your local town is going to be quite far away, like 30 minutes, if not more. And even then, it's going to be so rural. There's not going to be that much to do in the town. I mean, you might find enough stuff to fill 2 days off. But in these kind of rural Canadian towns, you do have some really nice, quaint things to do. Like, there'll be some used bookstores or like a nice ice cream shop. You know, there's enough stuff to do to explore and have a nice time. But I'll be honest, speaking from personal experience, by the end of the summer, you're really kind of stretching for things to do on your days off. And then, like we've mentioned, in the USA, you're never going to be that far away from a big city or town. Like, realistically, there are so many camps in the northeast of America that probably you're going to be no more than 2.5 hours away from one of New York City, Boston, or Philadelphia, right? And with most days off at camp, you get the night off as well. So if you wanted to travel to one of these big cities, you could easily do that and get back to camp before your day off finishes. And the thing is as well, like we mentioned, with America, the town's going to be bigger, you're going to have more strip malls. Like, another thing I've not even mentioned with Canada is that it can be really tricky to get to these different places. Like, Ubers just don't really exist outside of the big cities, whereas in America, they're a lot more accessible and cheaper than taxis. So in the USA, there's just way more stuff to do and stuff that's more accessible as well, like things that are a little bit closer. So with that in mind, we've got to give this category to the USA. It does win by a landslide. But if you're more interested in kind of exploring the nature and having more chill days off, then Canada might appeal more to you. So what does that tell us? Well, the results are 4-all, which is really strange. Look, if I'm being honest, I thought that Canada would win. I had a great time in both camps, but I think on balance, looking back on it, I enjoy my time in Canada just a little bit more. But what this has shown me, and hopefully you as well, is that each country offers different things and does different things slightly better than the other. But look, these are just my experiences and how I felt, and I had a great time working in Canada and America. And I think summer camps are just a fantastic opportunity that I would recommend to everybody. And look, the differences between Canada and America will appeal to different people. But if you found this interesting and would like to work in a summer camp, check out this video where I give you all of the information you need to know when applying to work in a summer camp in 2024. So I'll see you all there.